Hello, everybody, and welcome to our short interview series that we're having with housing advocates as well as other advocates and folks doing really important work to help families get ahead. And my name is Mike Loftin, and I'm a non-resident fellow at the Urban Institute and the CEO of Homewise. We're a New Mexico-based social enterprise that has been working to increase access to home ownership, affordable home ownership for over 30 years now. Joining me today is Amber Wallin, Executive Director of New Mexico Voices for Children. For 35 years, New Mexico Voices for Children has done a terrific work to address the root causes of poor child well-being, causes like poverty, inadequate nutrition, violence, pollution, and homelessness, among other things that affect the well-being of children. We're going to hear from Amber today about their important work that they are doing to address these problems and the systems that perpetuate them. Amber, again, I want to thank you for joining me.
Thanks for being here.
And so you've been at New Mexico Voices for over 10 years now, is my understanding. Can you tell us more about the work of New Mexico Voices for Children?
Sure. Well, you started it, Mike. For those who aren't familiar with New Mexico Voices, we were founded 35 years ago by a group of pediatricians who were treating children for health conditions in their offices, but who realized that in order to really address so many of the challenges that those children were facing, that they needed to go upstream, they needed to improve all of the public policies that were impacting those kids' lives in order to give them and their families really the best possible opportunities to thrive. And so at Voices, we do research, policy work, and advocacy work across a lot of different issue areas, economics, education, healthcare, early childhood care and education, taxes, lending, housing, all of those intertwined issue areas that can each individually and especially collectively have really big impacts on kids. And all of that work is really geared towards strengthening equity, creating educational and economic opportunities for family, building power for our communities in the state, and ultimately giving all New Mexico kids the opportunities to really thrive and shine.
Right. Well, no, that's great. I've been familiar with your work and been watching it for a long time, and I just so appreciate how insightful a lot of your reports and studies are, and how much credibility they have, and how much traction. I mean, I think it really has. You've been very effective at affecting some of the public policy in New Mexico that affects families and children. At Homewise, we're very focused on affordable housing and especially affordable home ownership. Can you talk about how housing issues are affecting family and children, and where you might see, what's the problem, where you might see opportunities for housing strategies to help improve the well-being of children?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And it's such critical work that you all do, because we know that housing is one of those key leverage points for child well-being, something that can influence so many other areas of their life, because we know that home ownership and housing stability and access to safe and affordable housing are linked to a number of positive outcomes for children, things like improved mental health, lower incarceration rates, better educational outcomes. And that some of those impacts, things like higher salaries as adults, those can actually carry over beyond childhood, and they're associated with greater economic opportunity in adulthood. But unfortunately, on the other side of that, of course, is the fact that when parents get evicted, they themselves are more likely to lose their jobs, more likely to experience negative physical and mental health. And we know that those challenges can be really tough on kids, and that those impacts can also in turn turn into a cycle that becomes hard to get out of, and that can cause lasting harm and trauma for kids, because research shows that children who experience homelessness and housing instability experience worse mental health outcomes and educational outcomes. And that's maybe not surprising that kids may carry immense stress and worry and be less able to study or to do well on a test when they don't know where they will sleep at night. But it should always be heartbreaking, particularly when it's an experience that over 10,000 children in New Mexico carry at some point during the school year. And so we think that addressing housing policy is one of those critical areas where we have a chance to really improve outcomes for so many New Mexico kids and families.
Right. Yeah. Well, it just strikes me, like hearing you talk, I mean, that the families, there's huge financial pressure on families, right? To limited income. Did an interview with Art Kaufman at University of New Mexico in health sciences of, just how big of a social determinant of health income is, and the pressures that create. And one thing we talked about is that, there's straight up income that and you can afford better housing and other things for your children if you have better income. But the other thing is housing is people's biggest monthly expense typically,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you can reduce people's monthly housing expense, you've basically increased their discretionary income, which allows to do, them to do other kinds of things, and also reduces their housing instability if they can actually afford their housing. And one thing, I've done a bunch of research with the Urban Institute on this, is that one thing that I don't think is well understood in housing is when we think about affordable housing, and especially people who are what lower income people need, we tend to think about rental housing, rent vouchers, public housing, those kinds of subsidized rental housing. And we don't really look at home ownership as a solution to the affordability of housing. And if you really look at the numbers, people who own their own homes on average pay 10% less on housing expense than people that rent. And that's true for lower income people. And it's true across race. So for instance, somebody making less than $50,000, a household making less than $50,000 a year, the typical homeowner pays 24% of their income on housing expense. The typical renter pays 34%, 10 percentage points difference. So just that, by way of, to make that more specific, if you look at someone making $40,000 a year, that difference amounts to about $333 a month. That's a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
That could be doing a lot of other things. So the thing that I'm really interested in hearing from you more about is, like, we oftentimes we focus on people in crisis and where they're, on homelessness and stuff like that, where there's really, really bad instability, housing instability. But how do we get upstream and get to the root of the problem so that people's housing is secure over the long term? It's affordable over the long term, and we're not just fighting fires all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
That people now are stable. They have financial stability and housing stability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it really, the work that you all do is fundamental in that, because it does get to home ownership. It gets to stability in children and families' lives. And then you're really talking about economic policy that puts kids and families first, and that helps build wealth, not just increase income, but that really helps build wealth. And a lot of the work that we do is around tax policy. And what does that look like to put kids and families and working parents first in tax policy? We've seen some incredible progress over the past few years in New Mexico with improvements in tax policy that targets benefits towards families in our state, that really works for families with kids and the communities of color that make up the big majority of our families. And so that's part of it. It's looking at wages. It's looking at predatory lending and putting caps on predatory lending so that families are able to keep more of that income and wealth that they bring. And it's about investing in education and in childcare, so families can afford childcare, they can afford housing, they can afford to know their kids are in safe places while they work and build the future.
Right. I just noticed that City of Albuquerque they just passed their new budget, which allocated $15 million a year just for city-funded rent vouchers, right, to help people with housing expense, which is a good thing. That they're stepping up that way, not just relying on federal money, but they're putting their own money forward to help people. What do you think of doing the same kind of thing with home ownership? That the state or local governments say, we're going to do not just rent vouchers, but a home ownership voucher. Here's, like, we're going to, if you're eligible, here's $20,000 to help you buy a home. Or whatever it is. And it's a one-time voucher, right? You don't have to do it every month. What do you think of something like that for those families that home ownership makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
Would that be helpful to them? Would that be a good policy?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, because we know, especially right now, so many families are struggling. There's 80,000 families in the state that are on the verge of eviction.
Right.
And 16 families are evicted from their housing every day. But getting families into permanent, stable housing giving them the opportunity to own their own homes. That's really a critical way. And like I said, it's a high leverage point. By
Right.
smoothing out stability for in housing for kids, that empowers them and their family to make gains in so many other areas. It means that they have a safe place to sleep every night. They're not worried about that. Parents can afford food and childcare. And so I think it really is a critical policy that has the opportunity to benefit so many kids in our state.
Yeah. And what, like, the last question I have for you is, what opportunity do you see, and how do you see this playing out, maybe where housing groups like Homewise, and there's other, Greater Albuquerque Housing Partnership that does rental housing in Albuquerque, and there's a bunch of housing groups and local governments that have housing strategies. How do you see us working with you, with New Mexico Voices, to advance like a strategy, a housing strategy that would get to the goals that you're trying to accomplish, which is improve the lives of children? Do you see any opportunities there? Is like, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that's become really clear in my decade at Voices, and in being privileged to get to work with community members and partners and policymakers across all these different issue areas that impact kids and our families and our communities for whole generations, is really how connected all of those issues are, and how connected New Mexicans are, both in our past and in our futures. And that connectedness really became even more apparent during the pandemic. Even when we were isolating, we were seeing how we really can't create opportunity for our state in a big way when so many of our families are facing hurdles, when communities of color are too often left out of economic opportunity, and when so many of our families don't know if they'll have a place to sleep every night. So what we know is we simply can't create lasting transformational change unless we collaborate, and that has to happen and be supported at different levels. It has to happen through direct service for our families most in need, as you said, through home ownership and empowerment programs like yours. And it also has to happen through policy change, through really changing the systems that have led to home ownership challenges for so many families, and led to the fact that 23% of families with kids in our state right now have little or no confidence in their ability to make their next rent or mortgage payment on time.
Yeah.
And so that's why we believe that we all have to collaboratively challenge and tackle those systems through legislative advocacy and through public policy change. And, we've seen what that can do in this year. In the past legislative session alone, we saw $25 million in annual recurring funding to New Mexico's Housing Trust Fund, which affordable housing development in the state is connected to that. And so we know that progress, that really big progress, like you said, big ideas, that's really possible in the state. And so, bottom line, our families and our communities are safer and healthier and can thrive best when everyone has a warm and a healthy place to live. And every one of us in the state has a stake in making that a reality.
Right. I think that's a great way to close. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, Amber. It's really good to get to know you a little bit better, and I'm looking forward to opportunities to working with you. I think I am very excited about the willingness of people to collaborate. And New Mexico has been we've had a lot of problems for a very long time, and I'm the most optimistic I've ever been, because I think there's so many people who are coming together to say we can do better than this. And I think we're going to do better at this, because there's a lot of great leadership out there that is working hard on this issue. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate you and all the work you do.